June 28, 1944, outskirts of St. Lo, Normandy. The battlefield trembled beneath a haze of smoke and dust. Burnt hedgerows smoldered where artillery had torn through them only minutes earlier. German tank commander Oberfeldwebel Hans Krüger steadied his binoculars, scanning the fields ahead. Through the drifting haze he saw an American Sherman, blackened by fire, turret half melted, tracks blown apart. It should have been finished. Then the impossible happened. The turret began to move. Slowly, creaking, it turned the 75mm gun, searching for its mark. Another Sherman crawled from behind a ridge, its armor scorched, but its engine still growling. Krüger froze. He'd watched Panzer IVs die from fewer hits. Yet these Shermans' crude, boxy, almost primitive, refused to die. The gunner beside him whispered, "Sie leben noch, they're still alive." Moments later, the Tiger's cannon roared, shattering the nearest Sherman. But even as flames engulfed it, the crew climbed out dazed, blackened, alive. Krüger lowered his binoculars in disbelief. For the first time, he wondered whether German steel alone could truly win this war. The shock on that field was only the beginning, a revelation that would ripple through every German armored unit from Normandy to the Rhine. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, tanks were not yet symbols of terror. They were tools, extensions of infantry, meant to support and advance. But in the hands of the Germans, they became the centerpiece of a new kind of war. From the Polish plains to the rolling fields of France, the German Wehrmacht unleashed a doctrine that stunned the world: blitzkrieg, lightning war, coordination of armor, air, and mechanized infantry moving as one spear. And at the heart of that spear were the panzers. Early German tanks, the Panzer I and II, were lightly armed, more training machines than true weapons. But their success was not in raw power. It was in how they were used. German commanders like Heinz Guderian understood speed, surprise, and communication would defeat numbers. Radios in every tank allowed rapid coordination, something Allied tanks lacked. By 1940, during the Battle of France, the Panzer III and IV had matured into formidable battlefield machines. French Char B1s and British Matildas were heavier, but German tactics outmaneuvered them. The myth began to form that German armor was unbeatable, and with that myth came pride. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, that pride seemed justified. Thousands of panzers rolled east across the Soviet frontier, cutting through the Red Army with breathtaking efficiency. But the illusion cracked when the Germans encountered the T-34, a Soviet tank faster, better sloped, and astonishingly resilient. It was a rude awakening. The T-34 forced German engineers back to the drawing board. Out of this desperation came two of the most feared machines of the war, the Panther and the Tiger. The Tiger Y, introduced in 1942, was an engineering marvel: 88mm gun, thick frontal armor, and immense psychological power. It could destroy a Sherman or T-34 from over a mile away. Its presence alone changed the rhythm of battle. The Panther, meanwhile, combined firepower with mobility, its sloped armor a direct answer to the Soviet threat. Together, they defined the golden age of German armor. Crews worshipped them, naming their tanks like ships Loa, Blitz, Elsa. Inside the Panzerwaffe, these machines weren't just weapons. They were proof of superiority, German craftsmanship at its purest, born of precision and pride. But hidden beneath that pride was fragility. Each Tiger required enormous resources, over 300,000 labor hours, complex components that broke easily in mud or snow, engines that overheated or froze. The Panther's final drives wore out after only a few hundred miles. Yet German crews trusted their armor like knights in steel fortresses. They believed no Allied tank could challenge them directly. By 1943, however, the war had shifted. German victories had slowed. Air superiority was fading. Fuel was scarce. The massive panzers, once symbols of domination, became burdens powerful, but few. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another philosophy was taking shape. The Americans were not building monsters. They were building something simpler, lighter, faster, easier to repair: the M4 Sherman. To German crews, it was an insult. A box on tracks, undergunned, underarmored, and mass-produced by factories that had never seen a battlefield. They mocked it as Tommy Cocker, the Tommy Cooker, because when hit, it burned easily, but they didn't yet understand what it truly was. The Sherman was not designed to outgun a Tiger. It was designed to win a war, not a duel. It could be repaired in days, replaced in hours, and produced in thousands. In the early months of 1944, as German crews prepared for the Allied invasion they knew would come, they waited with quiet confidence. They had the Tigers, the Panthers, and guns. They believed no machine from the West could survive a face-to-face encounter. They were wrong. What would soon unfold in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy would shatter that belief, revealing that sometimes the strongest armor isn't made of steel at all. Across the Atlantic, war was fought with pencils before bullets. In Detroit, in Toledo, in Cleveland, men in suits and engineers in oil-stained shirts gathered around blueprints that would shape the future of armored warfare. The United States was not yet at war when the M4 Sherman was conceived. But they were already thinking in terms the Germans never did: scale, efficiency, and survivability. In 1941, as Europe burned, the U.S. the Army Ordnance Department began designing a medium tank that could be produced by the thousands shipped across oceans, maintained in deserts, jungles, and snowfields alike. They wanted a tank that could move with infantry, cross bridges, climb slopes, and still fight on arrival. The result was the M4 Sherman. Its armor was modest, about 2 inches thick at most. Its 75mm gun could penetrate medium armor, but struggled against the heavier German tanks. Yet the Sherman had what the German machines lacked: reliability. It could travel over 2,000 kilometers without overhaul, something no Tiger or Panther could dream of. Its engine started in winter. Its parts were interchangeable across hundreds of models. It used standard ammunition, standard tracks, standard tools. For an army that was going to fight on 3 continents, that mattered more than any 88mm gun. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, production began at an industrial pace never seen before. By 1944, over 49,000 Shermans had rolled off assembly lines, more than all German Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs combined. America had turned its factories into an army. The philosophy behind the Sherman was brutally pragmatic. No single tank needed to be invincible if there were always more coming. But it wasn't just about numbers. The designers also thought about the men inside. German tanks were machines for engineers, complex, temperamental, and expensive. The Sherman was a machine for soldiers. It was easy to drive, easy to fix, and easy to replace. Crews could learn to operate it in weeks. When German intelligence first reported on the Sherman in 1942, they laughed. Too light, too high, too weak. They considered it another Allied failure like the British Crusader or the early Soviet BT series. But their laughter would fade on the beaches of Normandy when they realized what the Americans had truly built: a tank that kept coming back. Inside a Sherman, life was cramped, noisy, and hot. Ammunition lined the hull. Early models lacked wet stowage, meaning shells could ignite when struck. When that happened, the tank turned into a furnace in seconds, earning it the grim nickname Ronson, after the lighter brand that lights every time. But by 1944, the design had evolved. Improved ammunition storage reduced fires by nearly 75%. The new M4A3 and M4A3E8 Easy 8 models carried thicker frontal armor, better suspension, and a 76mm gun that could finally challenge German tanks head-on. Still, the real strength of the Sherman wasn't its gun or armor. It represented mobility, coordination, and overwhelming support. Every Sherman moved with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air cover. American doctrine didn't expect the tank to fight alone. When a Tiger appeared, the Shermans would flank, call in a P-47 Thunderbolt, or bombard it with artillery. In contrast, Germany's armor often fought in isolation, powerful but unsupported, magnificent yet doomed. By May 1944, as Allied divisions massed in southern England for the invasion of France, American crews trained tirelessly in their Shermans, running endless gunnery drills, engine checks, and field repairs. Many had never seen combat. Most had never faced a Tiger, but they trusted their machines. When the order finally came, Operation Overlord, more than 6,000 Sherman tanks would land in France within weeks. Waiting for them were the veterans of the Panzer divisions, men who had fought from Moscow to Kursk to the Italian mountains. They were confident, even contemptuous. To them, the coming clash would be a slaughter. But on the other side of the channel, American crews believed something different. They didn't need the biggest tank. They just needed to survive long enough to fire back. And when they met in the hedgerows of Normandy, both sides would learn that victory didn't belong to the thickest armor or the longest gun. It belonged to the tank that refused to stop fighting. The confrontation was coming, and it would redefine the meaning of survivability in modern war. On paper, the M4 Sherman was no match for a Panther or a Tiger. Its 75mm gun could barely pierce German armor from the front. Its armor was flat, its silhouette high, its hull box-like. But underneath that simplicity lay something far more important: reliability. American engineers had designed the Sherman like a factory product, not a boutique masterpiece. Every component could be replaced with a wrench and an hour's work. The transmission could be removed in the field. Engines were interchangeable between variants. Tracks could be swapped by hand, for the U.S. This meant the Germans could never achieve operational continuity. While a Tiger might take weeks to repair after throwing a track or suffering engine failure, a Sherman could be patched up and back in combat by sunset. The German tanks were built like fine watches. The Sherman was built like a hammer crude, but it always worked. Its mechanical heart, the Continental or Ford V8 engine, was tough and forgiving. Even after a near-direct hit, crews could often restart their tank and drive away. Its suspension was simple, its fuel system straightforward, its electrical wiring accessible. Most crucially, the Sherman had something German tanks never prioritized: crew survivability. The interior layout gave men room to escape. The turret hatch was large and easy to open, even under stress. Later models introduced wet ammunition storage surrounding shells with water glycol to prevent them from igniting when hit. American research later found that the introduction of this system cut catastrophic fires by nearly 3/4. That meant men who might have died inside had a chance to live. The Sherman could be knocked out, but it rarely killed its crew outright. German crews began to notice that their opponents would often be back in a new tank within days. Destroying one Sherman didn't mean ending the fight. It only meant another would take its place. By late 1944, this simple, rugged machine had evolved into a living organism, one that could be wounded, repaired, and reborn endlessly. To German tankers raised on precision and pride, that was incomprehensible. For the men inside, the Sherman was both a lifeline and a coffin. It smelled of oil, sweat, and cordite. The interior was barely wider than a man's shoulders. When the hatches closed, there was no sky, only the vibration of the engine and the rattle of the tracks. Many crews called it a death trap. They had seen tanks hit and burst into flames in seconds. The sound of burning ammunition and a deafening series of internal detonations haunted their sleep. Yet they climbed back in every morning, tightening bolts, checking radios, and stowing ammunition once more. Courage in a Sherman wasn't the loud kind. It was quiet, routine, methodical. Crews learned to trust each other more than their armor. They memorized escape routes, drilled hatch openings, and rehearsed who would grab the wounded first if the tank was hit. When the battle came, that trust kept them alive. In Normandy's hedgerows, Shermans were often ambushed at point-blank range by concealed Panthers and anti-tank guns. When fire spread through the turret, crews had seconds to act. Many escaped with their uniforms aflame, faces blackened, eyes filled with smoke but alive, and they always went back. The reason was simple. They believed in momentum. They knew their machines were replaceable, but their mission wasn't. Every Sherman knocked out was quickly replaced, sometimes overnight. Replacement tanks arrived with fresh paint, new shells, and the same name stenciled on the turret as the one that burned the day before. To the Germans, this endless return felt supernatural. They would destroy a platoon of Shermans in the morning, only to face another by afternoon. To the Americans, it was logistics, not luck. The men inside those tanks didn't fight for glory. They fought to finish the job, to get home, and to keep each other alive long enough to see the war end. That quiet determination, not armor, not firepower, made the Sherman something far greater than its design. It became the tank that refused to die, because the men inside refused to give up. The Sherman's greatest strength wasn't what it carried, it was how it was used. American armored doctrine didn't seek duels with Tigers or Panthers, it avoided them. The Sherman was never intended to fight tank versus tank battles on open fields. Its true purpose was combined arms warfare to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and keep moving. Every Sherman crew understood this from training. They worked closely with artillery, infantry, and air support. When a Panther appeared, they didn't charge it. They marked it. Coordinates were sent by radio to nearby artillery batteries or P-47 Thunderbolts circling above. Minutes later, the sky would split open with rockets and bombs, and the threat would vanish. On the ground, the Americans mastered maneuver tactics. A single Sherman was vulnerable. 5 Shermans working in concert could overwhelm almost anything. They moved fast, flanked hard, and struck where the enemy was weakest. If one was hit, the others pressed on not out of recklessness, but because they knew reinforcements were always behind them. The Germans, bound by dwindling resources, couldn't match this tempo. Their Panthers and Tigers often fought isolated, covering retreats or holding defensive lines. Their superior optics and guns gave them the advantage in the first shot, but once flanked, their heavy armor became a trap. By late 1944, Allied commanders were perfecting the art of overwhelming concentration. A Tiger might destroy 3 Shermans, but 15 more would surround and destroy it. The equation was brutal and simple. If a single Sherman's chance of survival was low, the collective's chance of victory was high. In this way, tactics replaced armor. Each Sherman was a small part of a much larger organism, an army that moved like a machine, fueled by logistics, precision planning, and air supremacy. To the German tankers who faced them, it felt like drowning in steel. For German tank crews, the Tiger and Panther had once been symbols of destiny. Their thick armor and devastating guns made them kings of the battlefield until Normandy. There, in the chaos of smoke and hedgerows, that confidence began to crack. They would ambush an American column, destroy several Shermans, and retreat. Hours later, the same road filled again with more Shermans identical, unstoppable. Endless reports from the 2nd SS Panzer Division described enemy armor returning faster than it can be destroyed. Field commanders complained of exhaustion not from fighting, but from the hopelessness of repetition. They realized they were not fighting machines, but production lines. German crews also began to notice something else. Shermans often burned, yes, but their crews survived. Prisoners captured after tank engagements described climbing out of flaming wrecks, being issued a new tank within days, and returning to the same fight. That was unimaginable to the Germans. A lost Tiger meant a lost crew, a shattered investment of time and steel. By the winter of 1944, this psychological divide had deepened. German tankers no longer measured success in kills. They measured it in delay. They knew that every tank they destroyed was already being replaced somewhere beyond the Channel, in a factory that never slept. Morale reports from late 1944 reveal a haunting tone. Panzer crews wrote that, "The enemy's material strength is inhuman, our courage cannot defeat production." They had begun the war believing their armor was indestructible. Now they watched as endless columns of Shermans advanced through the smoke, taking hit after hit, and still moving forward. The myth of German invincibility had turned to disbelief, and disbelief to fear, because the one thing they could not destroy was American persistence. June saw Normandy was a nightmare of mud, hedgerows, and ambushes. The Allies had landed, but progress was measured in yards, not miles. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow could hide a gun. For American tank crews, the Sherman's greatest advantage, its mobility, was crippled by the terrain. The Germans knew this. Concealed in thick bocage country, Panthers and 88mm anti-tank guns waited like predators. When the first Shermans rolled forward beyond the beaches, they didn't know where death would come from. Often it came from nowhere. A Panther could fire from 1,500 meters away, its round piercing the Sherman's front armor with ease. Crews inside rarely saw the flash before impact. Sometimes a single German shell could ignite the ammunition rack and turn the tank into an inferno in seconds. Yet, what astonished the Germans wasn't how easily Shermans burned, but how quickly they came back. The Allied front never ran out of armor. By the end of June, over 2,500 Shermans had already landed in Normandy. Destroyed tanks were salvaged overnight, repaired under canvas in muddy fields, and returned to battle. German crews began to realize something chilling. For every Tiger they fielded, the Americans had 50 Shermans, but numbers alone didn't explain what was happening. Something deeper was changing both in machine and in man. In late July, during Operation Cobra, American tactics evolved. Instead of head-on assaults through narrow hedgerows, engineers used bulldozers and explosive rhino plows to carve new paths. Tank infantry teams began working as one organism. Shermans moved in pairs, flanking instead of charging. The result was devastating. Once the Sherman's mobility returned, its full design philosophy came alive. It could cross rough ground, pivot on the move, and reposition faster than any German tank. German tankers used to dominating from range suddenly found themselves surrounded. In one after-action report, a Panther commander wrote, "They come from the sides and rear and they do not stop. Even when hit, the next one keeps advancing." The U.S. The Army also introduced upgraded models into the fight, notably the M4A3E8, nicknamed the Easy 8. It was the Sherman perfected. Fitted with the 76mm high-velocity gun, new suspension, and a more powerful 4GAA engine, it was faster, steadier, and deadlier. It could finally penetrate a Panther's side armor, and crucially, it could fire while moving with precision no German tank could match. When the Easy 8s entered combat in late 1944, German crews were caught off guard. They expected more of the same weak Shermans. Instead, they faced a tank that closed the technological gap. In the fields outside St. Lo, an Easy 8 platoon engaged a group of Panthers head-on. The lead Sherman was hit and the first two shells tore through its front, killing the driver instantly. But the others flanked through a wheat field, moving faster than the Panthers could traverse their heavy turrets. Within minutes, 2 German tanks were smoking wrecks. The survivors retreated. For the first time, American crews didn't just survive, they won the duel. The psychological tide began to turn. Sherman crews who once whispered about death traps now spoke with confidence. Their tanks might not have been the best, but they were good enough, and there were enough of them. By August, the German panzer divisions in Normandy were exhausted. The Tiger battalions, once feared, were running out of fuel and spare parts. Each mechanical failure cost them more than enemy fire. Many were abandoned and blown up by their own crews. Meanwhile, Shermans rolled past their burning hulks, their engines humming, their crews grim but steady. The myth of German invulnerability was breaking. And in its place rose a new reality, one built not on perfection but persistence. As Allied forces broke through at St. Lo and swept toward Paris, German commanders began sending desperate messages to Berlin. They spoke of endless armor, of enemy tanks returning from the dead. They didn't know yet that the worst was still coming, that before the year's end in the frozen forests of Belgium, the Sherman would face its ultimate test. The Battle of the Bulge would show once and for all what these American machines could truly survive. December 1944. The Ardennes forest is dark, frozen and silent beneath falling snow. For weeks, Allied lines had grown complacent. The war, they believed, was nearing its end. German resistance was collapsing. The Reich was running out of fuel, men, and hope. Then, on December 16th, the forest erupted. At dawn, over 1,000 German guns opened fire. Panthers and Tigers rolled from the woods, cutting through the mist. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last gamble, had begun. The aim was simple: split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force the West to negotiate. Caught in the onslaught, American forces reeled backward. Columns were ambushed on icy roads, tanks bogged down in snow-choked valleys. For the Sherman crews, the winter offensive felt like hell reborn. German heavy armor ruled the frozen battlefields. The Tiger, too. King Tiger, an immense 70-ton monster with armor nearly impenetrable to Sherman guns, appeared for the first time in numbers. Its 80mm gun could destroy a Sherman from 2 miles away. To many U.S. tankers, it seemed hopeless. But where the German offensive relied on power, the Americans answered with endurance. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, Sherman crews fought side by side with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. Fuel was scarce, the cold unbearable, but the tanks kept moving. Mechanics tore engines apart in sub-zero air, thawing frozen oil with campfires. Damaged Shermans were cannibalized for parts to keep others alive. When the King Tigers came, the Shermans couldn't match them gun for gun. Instead, they hunted in packs. They waited in the fog, aimed for the flanks, and called in artillery the instant they were spotted. Every Sherman knew its role to survive, distract, delay. In one of the most brutal encounters near St. Vith, a platoon of Shermans ambushed a Tiger column at 200 yards. The first 2 Shermans were destroyed instantly. The third took a hit that tore through the turret, killing 2 men. But the 4th Sherman, maneuvering behind a burning farmhouse, struck a King Tiger's exposed rear armor. The shell ignited the engine compartment and the beast went up in flames. Even as their comrades' tanks burned beside them, the American crews didn't withdraw. They radioed coordinates, bringing down a rain of artillery that forced the remaining German armor to retreat. Survivors later recalled seeing the burned-out husks of their own tanks still glowing in the snow and feeling pride, not fear. They had held. The tide turned again, not through power but persistence. By late December, the German offensive stalled. Their fuel convoys were destroyed by Allied aircraft. Panthers were abandoned on frozen roads, their engines seized. Tiger II tanks, unable to turn or refuel, were blown up by their own crews. The Sherman, with its wide tracks and lighter weight, moved where the massive German tanks could not. Its engines kept running. Its crews kept fighting. In one chilling report from the 9th Panzer Division, a German officer wrote, "Our tanks are superior, yet they cannot last. The enemies are inferior, yet they never end." That single sentence captured the essence of the war's final phase. As January dawned and the Allies counterattacked, endless columns of Shermans rolled forward through the wreckage of the Ardennes. They passed destroyed Panthers frozen in ditches, their crews long dead. The Shermans were scarred, blackened, patched with welding marks and shrapnel holes, but alive. Every shell that failed to stop them chipped away at the myth of German superiority. The same crews who had once mocked these inferior machines now faced them with dread. A Tiger gunner captured near Bastogne later admitted under interrogation, "We stopped counting how many we destroyed. It no longer mattered. They always came back." By the time the snow began to melt in early 1945, the German armored core was broken. The Panthers and Tigers, once symbols of terror, were ghosts running on fumes and faith. The Sherman had not outgunned them. It had outlasted them. And as the Allied forces crossed the Rhine that spring, even the most hardened German tank commanders could no longer deny what they had seen. A tank that should have died, but didn't. A machine that embodied not perfection, but endurance. The lesson had been written in fire and steel. Cross every frozen road from Bastogne to Cologne, and when the smoke cleared, it was the Sherman, battered, unglamorous, indestructible, that kept rolling east toward victory. Spring, 1945, Germany lay in ruins. The once mighty Wehrmacht was collapsing in every direction, its fuel exhausted, its cities in flames. When Allied troops captured the last Tiger IIs and Panthers in the Rhineland, engineers swarmed over the wrecks. American and British ordnance teams wanted answers. Why had their inferior tanks survived in a war of giants? The findings stunned them. German armor was formidable but fragile. The massive tanks that had terrified Allied crews for years were mechanical nightmares. Each Panther needed constant maintenance. Each Tiger demanded a level of care no frontline unit could provide. Final drives cracked. Engines overheated. Transmissions seized after only a few hundred miles. One U.S. ordnance officer summarized it bluntly. The Germans built masterpieces. We built machines for war. The Sherman, by contrast, was engineered for reliability. Its engine could be replaced in hours, not days. Its suspension absorbed punishment mile after mile. Where a Tiger broke down on a cold morning, a Sherman simply started and moved. Captured German reports confirmed this painful reality. A surviving document from Panzer Lehr Division dated January 1945 lamented, "Enemy armor returns to the field with shocking speed. Our own repairs are impossible under fire. Morale suffers when our best weapons stand idle." In the aftermath of the Ardennes, U.S. units conducted their own tests. Shermans recovered from battlefields were brought to workshops. Engineers counted the scars of 88 mm impacts, near-miss craters, and shrapnel gouges that had failed to penetrate. They discovered something remarkable. Most Sherman losses were not from direct penetrations, but from fires caused by ammunition storage. That weakness had already been addressed in 1944 with wet stowage, water-jacketed ammunition racks that reduced burn-through by nearly 75%. Crews who survived because of it called their tanks lucky, but it was more than luck, it was evolution through combat experience. Meanwhile, German intelligence officers studying the wreckage of destroyed Shermans were equally astonished. They found that even when heavily damaged, many of the tanks had remained operational long enough to retreat or rescue their crews. In one report to the OKH German Army High Command, an engineer wrote, "The American tank shows alarming endurance. Multiple hits do not stop it. Its crews display determination equal to its engine." The phrase "determination equal to its engine" circulated among Allied analysts for years afterward. It captured what no armor thickness could measure: the combination of design, training, and will. Back in Washington, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department compiled its final wartime evaluation of the M4 Sherman. The document, Report Number 4745, Tank Combat Performance, concluded, "The Sherman's success lies not in superiority, but sufficiency in a balance of firepower, protection, and reliability that made victory possible. It was a statement of philosophy as much as engineering." In April 1945, when American tank battalions rolled across the shattered bridges of the Rhine, German prisoners often stood silently watching. Among them were tank crews who had once manned Panthers and Tigers. They stared at the columns of battered Shermans patched, scorched, some missing fenders, or with welded armor plates scavenged from wrecks, and many could not hide their disbelief. These were the same tanks they had been told were weak, yet they had survived the impossible. For German crews who had spent years believing in technical perfection, the sight carried a deep sting. They had learned too late that war is not won by perfection, but by persistence. The battlefield had proven it mercilessly. By the time Berlin fell in May 1945, the myth of German armored invincibility was gone. Captured Wehrmacht officers, many from elite panzer divisions, spoke with weary disbelief about what they had seen on the Western Front. Their diaries and debriefs reflected a quiet humiliation, not of being defeated by superior firepower, but by what they once called inferior design. To them, the Sherman had been a joke undergunned, thinly armored, a machine built for mass rather than mastery. Yet it was these same inferior tanks that had rolled past their dead comrades, one field at a time, until the Reich itself lay under American tracks. A former Tiger commander, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Weiner, captured near Cologne, told Allied interrogators, "We thought they would run, but they always returned. It was like fighting the sea's endless waves. You could sink 1, 10, 100, and still it came back." That was the quiet horror many German crews carried to the end, the realization that no matter how skilled, no matter how perfect their tank, they were outmatched by a war machine built to endure. After the war, U.S. and British intelligence teams compiled thousands of these testimonies. The common theme wasn't fear of Sherman guns, it was exhaustion. Mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and constant Allied pressure had broken even the most elite panzer units long before their morale did. At the same time, Allied engineers began shaping the next generation of tanks with lessons learned from the Sherman's philosophy. The British Centurion, the American M26 Pershing, and later the M48 Patton all followed the same principle. Not the heaviest, not the most complex, but the most balanced. Survivability through reliability, firepower through practicality. The Germans, too, in the post-war years quietly adopted similar logic. When the Bundeswehr was formed in the 1950s and the Leopard 1 entered design, its engineers rejected the idea of a supertank. Instead, they emphasized speed, mobility, and maintainability values once mocked but proven by the Sherman in blood. Even Soviet doctrine echoed it. The T-34, much like the Sherman, relied on endurance and production. Together they defined modern armored warfare, quantity that could outlast quality. But beyond the steel and strategy lay the emotional aftermath of the memories carried by men who had lived inside those machines. For American crews, the Sherman became both friend and grave. Survivors often spoke of their tanks as if they were living things. Old, reliable, the stubborn mule, the fireproof beast. They remembered how the tank shook when hit, how the engine roared back to life after every close call, how a simple machine had carried them through hell and home again. For German veterans, however, memories were haunted. They had entered the war believing in invincibility and armor so thick, in guns so powerful that no enemy could stand before them. To watch those beliefs burn one battlefield at a time left scars that lasted decades. In 1952, a former Panzer officer wrote in a veteran's journal, "We learned too late that war rewards the practical, not the perfect." That sentence would echo through military, schools and tank design bureaus long after the war, because the Shermans' legacy wasn't just about survival. It was about redefining what victory meant. It wasn't the best tank in the world. It didn't need to be. It was the tank that was always there in every weather, every front, every desperate fight. And for those who had once laughed at its silhouette, its endurance became a kind of haunting reminder that wars are not won by fear or fame, but by persistence, logistics, and the will to keep moving when everything else breaks down. By 1945, that truth had been burned into every frozen road and every shattered field across Europe. And as the last German tanks lay silent, their crews finally understood what they had seen. Not a miracle of engineering, but the triumph of endurance over perfection. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the battlefields were graveyards of steel. Burned-out Tigers and Panthers stood half-buried in mud, their hulks frozen where they died. Beside them, hundreds of Shermans, some wrecked, others still running, marked the path of an army that had never stopped moving. To the German tankers who had once laughed at those machines, it was a sobering sight. They had worshipped precision, every weld perfect, every shell deadly, and yet in the end it was the plain, unglamorous Sherman that reached the Rhine and beyond. History rarely rewards beauty. It rewards endurance. The Sherman became the embodiment of that truth, not a weapon of fear, but of resolve. It taught the world that victory isn't the product of invincible armor or superior firepower, but of relentless adaptation of ordinary men in imperfect machines who refused to stop fighting. For the soldiers who lived inside them, the tank wasn't just metal. It was a memory. Each dent told a story of survival. Each patch of scorched paint marked a day they made it through. And for the men who once stood against them, those same scars told another story of pride broken by persistence, of brilliance defeated by simplicity. In the decades that followed, armies around the world remembered the lesson written across Europe's burning fields. A tank must not just fight. It must endure. From Korea to the Middle East, from the Cold War to modern battlefields, the descendants of the Sherman carried that legacy. Not perfect, not pretty, but alive, and that was enough. Even today, somewhere in a forgotten barn or museum yard, a Sherman still sits under the dust. Its olive hull faded, its gun silent. Yet when the light hits it just right, you can almost feel what those crews once felt. The hum of the engine, the breath of men who trusted it to bring them home. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, but they endured. And in the story of war, that more than anything is what history remembers.